Okay, welcome to a new video, and there's been a thread going around the VC over the last few weeks. One album is enough, or by an artist, and the purpose of this is regarding the fact that we are prone to collecting lots and lots of albums by an artist and really turn to one in particular that really caught our fancy at the beginning of our love affair with that particular artist. So I've decided to do my own, and I'm going to do two videos. The first lot, I think about 12 albums, and they are albums, not songs from albums. They are about the album. Cover the late 60s through the 70s. Okay, so we've got about 12 of those. These albums I consider to be 5-star albums. They really captured my imagination when I first listened to them, and they've held their love throughout. So there we have it. So in the description there will be, as always, links to the audio, and where appropriate there might be some slides about the band, and also maybe a lyric or two. I'm not going to do lyrics for everything, but images of the album, of course, and we will probably give you a little bit of a history as I go through. Okay, so let's get started, and the first one is Forever Changes, and this was released in 1967 by the American band from the West Coast, Love, and it was their third album and the final album recorded by the original lineup of this band, fronted by Arthur Lee, ably supported by one Brian McLean. These were the two writers, and after the completion of this album, McLean left the group, and Lee actually decided to disband the formation and start again. On this particular album, though, there were a number of Los Angeles session musicians. They played on 2 songs, as I say, all written by Love, apart from a couple of songs by McLean. It's built around an interwoven acoustic guitar texture and some subtle orchestrations with strings and horns, and they reinforced and punctuated the melodies. The first 4 songs, Alone Again, All House Is Not a Motel, and More Again, and The Daily Paddock, seem to segue a little bit together. Alone Again All was written by Brian McLean, and it's an absolute classic. And More Again by Lee, gorgeous vocals here, and impeccable instrumentation. At a time when the guitar was becoming my love, my first love, this was a breath of fresh air, and it definitely caught my imagination. There is some sort of hint of Beach Boys influences on here, and their drummer, Hal Blaine, actually played drums on the Forever Changes recording. It's remarkably innovative, and as I say, Lee, who sort of was quite influenced by Jimi Hendrix, but this sort of album hinted at the development which Hendrix was starting to explore on Electric Ladyland, but of course he passed, and so he wasn't able to move in this direction. Lee envisaged the album very much as a lament to his memory, and there we have it. That's my first choice, Forever Changes by Love. So I'm having particular problems getting this camera right, because as you can imagine, I've made notes for this. It's not on off the cuff, because I'm 69 years of age, but I have put together the edit, and I feel it's quite informative. At 11 then is Ogden's Nut Gone Flake, released in 1968 by the band The Small Faces, They were very much a singles band in the mid 60s. Great songs, Itchy Park, Tin Soldier, come to mind. And another big single was on this album. I didn't actually buy this album when it came out, but I later acquired it, so to speak. And it's an album by the band that really weren't an albums band. And so if you've got this album, you really don't need to get into the other ones. Of course, the title of the album was a brand of a tin tobacco that was produced in Liverpool back at the end of the 19th century by one Thomas Ogden. It was their fourth studio album and a loose concept album, and the studio album was their final one with the original lineup, that being Stevie Marriott on guitar, vocals and songwriter, Ronnie Lane who chipped in with writing as well, and Ian McLagan on keyboards and Kenny Jones on drums, and this album was regarded as very close to the psychedelia that was around at the time, and of course only a year on from Sgt. Pepper. It had very much a Cockney flair to it, and it included, as I mentioned before, Lazy Sunday, which was an absolute storming hit. What else can we say about it? The side 2 was based on a fairy tale concept about a boy named Happiness, Stan, and consisting of a bit of a musical suite of 6 songs interlinked, with narration provided by a comic monologue and performer, a genius of the funny, nonsensical English language, Stanley Unwin, and his style of vocal delivery, was so significant that it actually became known as Unwinese. So now you know. A great album. I don't play that often, but certainly it's one of those albums that is enough with regard to the Small Faces. But I'm not suggesting you shouldn't get the singles as well. Okay, that's the second of my choices. So my third choice then, a year later, an album was released by a band called 10 Years After, and it was titled Shh. And it was their third album, and it's, as far as I'm concerned, by far their best album with the original lineup. They actually made 11 albums from 67 to 74, and the original band, of course, became extremely famous after their appearance at the Woodstock Pop Festival, where on the movie we see Alvin Lee, the guitarist, singer and songwriter, going hell for leather while singing I'm Coming Home. The album is a terrific blues psychedelic rock album, with Lee leading a tight band which included Leo Lyons on bass, Chick Churchill on keyboards and Rick Lee on drums. It was a mix of blues covers. We have I Woke Up This Morning, with some scorching guitar. Two Time Mama, one of the tracks, has some very intricate slide guitar by Lee, and there's a terrific intro song called Bad Scene that's heavy, almost punk-like, and it has speedy guitar by Lee. He was renowned for the way he moved up and down that fretboard. Some great blues numbers here, mixed with good solid ballads and heavy rockers. So that's my third choice. It's the one you ought to get. It's called Shh, and it's by 10 Years After, English band of course. My fourth offering is an album which was released in 1970. Only one album by this band, as far as I'm aware, and it was an absolute cracker. It was called Fotheringay, and the star of the show was one Sandy Denny, She had left the Fairport Convention in 1969, but this venture that she put together with some new musicians called Fotheringay, well, it didn't last very long, and 71 it passed into the annals of history as Sandy went solo. The Closer is probably the highlight of, and this is an album that I came to much later on. I wasn't into this style of music back in the early 70s, but as my appreciation developed for Richard Thompson in the sort of 90s, I then decided, oh well, I better check out Fairport Convention. And then of course logically, well, what about Sandy Denny after her magnificent delivery on Legion Leaf? So that's how I came to Fotheringay. But as I say, that final track on this album is called Banks of the Nile, and it's 8 minutes, and it's a terrific story about young men leaving the shores of the UK, England as it was then, and going to fight in Egypt. Of course, historically quite accurate. And 9 songs, 7 of them were written by Denny, with 2 covers, Too Much of Nothing, which was Dylan's song, and a song by Tim Buckley, a name escapes me. But this is a thoroughly brilliant piece of folk rock music, and I really suggest you get to listen to it. It's called Fotheringay, and it was released in 1970, and the band's name was Fotheringay. So moving on then, my next one that I've chosen is from 1971, and by this time I was getting more and more into American music, courtesy of a school friend of mine, and I'd been listening to a lot of his albums on vinyl, of course, in those days, and this was one that he thrust upon me one evening, and I surprisingly took to it like a duck to water. It was a sort of soft rock type folk. It wasn't really folk, the album, although the 2 members of this band that created it, Jim Messina and Kenny Loggins was definitely from the sort of singer-songwriter stable. It was called Sitting In. It was the debut by Loggins and Messina. Of course, Messina produced the album and played guitar and sang, and his career had moved and blossomed when he was a member of Buffalo Springfield, and after he left them, he started his own band called Poco with Richie Fury, who was also in Springfield. But then he launched this duet with Kenny Loggins, who was virtually unknown at the time, and this album was one of 11 that they released right up until 1977. What struck me about the album was it incorporated some sort of woodwind instruments, oboe, flute, there was horn in there with sax, and string instruments, viola, and also a bit of steel drums cropped up. It was a beautiful album, really. Some standout tracks. Back to Georgia is a really honky sort of country rock type song. House on Pooh Corner was written by Loggins, and of course was reminding us all of the beauties of being a child. In the lyric and the title, there's reference to Christopher Robin and Winnie the Pooh, of course, 2 well-loved sort of animated characters from books that children had absolutely taken to, and this was an appreciation of that. And then on side 1 there's a tremendous trilogy of music that goes on for about 10 minutes. Loving Me, To Make a Woman Feel Wanted, and then Peace of Mind. you know, it moves through sort of different tempos, and Peace of Mind is a very slow ballady conclusion. Second side's pretty good as well. So if you wanted to buy an album by Loggins and Messina and you weren't quite sure what to get, I would suggest you get the debut. They never surpassed that. Although they did do a very, very good live album a couple of years later called On Stage, and the treatment of the songs was, well, live and as good as their studio offerings. So there we have it, sitting in Loggins and Messina. Great band. My next choice, 1972, and this was an album that was basically put together by Stephen Stills, and he got Chris Hillman in as his sort of sideman to create Manassas, and that's the title of the first album by this project. They didn't last too long, but this double album, and I've reviewed it on my channel, and there'll be a link to that review, an extensive review. But this album again was one that was presented to me by my friend Simon. If you ever get to see this, Simon, it's a big acknowledgement to your influence on my musical taste. Yeah, Simon was a big Steve Stills fan, and guitar was his sort of love, and Manassas. Chris Hillman, as I say, had been with the Byrds and then moved on to the Flying Burritos, and he then teamed up with Stills, who had obviously just come off the Crosby, Stills, Nash projects, and the band that were put together included Dallas Taylor on drums, Fizzy Samuel on bass, Paul Harris on keyboards, Al Perkins on pedal steel guitar, and Joe Lala on percussion. First of two albums before Stills concentrated on being a solo artist. What I loved about this album was the contrast. It was split into 4 thematic sides, and they were all given a name. The opener side was called The Raven, very much a mix of rock and Latin sounds, which I absolutely adored, and it really did turn me on to Latin music, which continues to this day. The group would often perform these songs that are sort of segued together live, and there are recordings of some of the material on this album on YouTube, courtesy of an appearance by Manassas on a sort of early 70s rock music show out of Germany called The Beat Club. So try and track that down. I'll put a few links to some of the songs that you can watch on video from that show, and it's absolutely breathtaking listening to and watching these guys perform. The second side of the album was called The Wilderness, and it mainly centered on country music and bluegrass. Not my favorite genre, but on this particular album I lapped it up. Side 3 is called Consider and was largely folk rockish, and contains the immaculate song Johnny's Garden, which reportedly was about the caretaker at Stills' English Manor home that he bought from one Ringo Starr. And this includes Stills at his most experimental. There's Moog synthesizers on this side on Move Around, which is very, very spacey and ballady. The fourth side was called Rock and Roll Is Here to Stay, and it's virtually a rock and blues set. Other standout tracks on this album, Jet Set on the first side, and on side 4 I really love The Treasure. and it's the sort of penultimate track before he does a blues on acoustic guitar. Spills, that is. But on the Treasure, the rhythm with Samuel and Taylor is terrific, and try and catch the change of rhythm sort of midway through. Spellbinding stuff. So there we have it, Manassas, 1972. They only made 2 albums, but I'd suggest this first one would be sufficient. The seconds are not bad, but you can do without it. You can't do without the debut though. Stills at his very, very best. Going on a bit long this video, so I'm going to try and be a bit more brief. My next selection is from the following year, 1973, and a complete contrast really, but I've chosen the Isley Brothers, 3+3. I was a great lover of Motown when I was a wee boy. You couldn't really avoid not listening to it and enjoying it. It was on the radio every day, and of course the Isley Brothers were right there at the beginning really, and so this album was their 11th, sort of 10 years on really in their career, and they had a slight change of style on this. It became much more rock-like, with those soul and Tamla vocals remaining, of course. And the Isley Brothers on this album, there were 4 brothers, Ernie, Ron, Rudolph and Marvin, and they were joined by their sister's husband, one Chris Jasper, who played clavinet, moog and piano. The highlight to me, beyond the great vocal of course, was Ernie Isley. Ernie had obviously been listening to a lot of Jimi Hendrix, and his guitar style had developed in that direction, and you can hear it crystal clear on the solo on Summer Breeze, which was a single, alongside Who's That Lady. Both were huge singles, and I've treasured this album right since 73, and we're of course 50 years on. If you've never heard 3+3, you are surely lacking. Go and get it and listen to it. 3+3 by the Isley Brothers from 1973.